For most of my childhood, I lived in fear for my life because if I brought home a grade less than an A on an exam or especially a report card from school, my parents would just beat me. Not every time, but often enough that it'll instill an oppressive amount of fear in me for days, from the time when I find out to when they'll eventually find out. One time, they even forced me to stand outside without a jacket when it was 10 below freezing in winter in frickin' Michigan. Even if they didn't beat me, it's still very likely they'd yell at me endlessly. And I'd end up losing various privileges like using the computer and leisure or doing anything fun. And they go on and on every single day when I'm at dinner, when I just got back from school right before I went to bed, about how bad I'm doing. And it's not in an encouraging way, but in a very anxiety-inducing and demotivating way until I manage to bring those grades back up, which could take months. There were only maybe a handful of cases when I brought home a grade less than an A, and they just simply let it go without any incident. In secondary school, you always had exams, and you get your report card every few months, and nearly every week of the school year was filled with worry because out of the countless grades you get on exams and the report card, anything less than a perfect A could end up triggering my parents, especially my dad. I remember in the beginning, I'd often lie about bad grades on, say, tests, hoping that a good grade on a later test will average it out and result in a magical A on the final report card that comes out. I was friends with another Chinese kid back in junior high who had the reputation of being one of the smart ones for getting such good grades in school. I still remember him getting a ton of rewards in his junior high graduation, and the whole school auditorium was clapping for him, and that was nearly 30 years ago. We eventually went to different high schools, and he eventually went to medical school at UCLA. Anyways, back when we were friends, he confided with me how his parents would beat him if his grades were less than perfect, just like mine were, and how he'd often throw away his graded assignments and tests so his parents won't discover them. And keep in mind, he had slightly better grades than mine. We'd sometimes secretly discuss ways to keep our grades hidden from our parents as much as possible, so that we'd minimize the number of beatings we got. One time, I even snuck out to the mailbox at my house and waited for the mail to arrive every single day for a week. Not for the report card, but for a progress report, which is a mid-semester snapshot of the grades in my classes, rather than the final set-in-stone report card. And I was intent on intercepting it and hiding it because I was expecting to get a C in English when my parents were expecting an A, not just in English, but in every single class. And this was decades ago, before teachers would report grades via the internet, so you can't intercept it anymore. I eventually brought the grade back up to something like a B or a B minus by the end of the semester, which resulted in me getting brutally beaten again. But I think I ended up saving myself a second round of beating with this tactical move. Later that year, my PSAT scores came out, and I was embarrassed to tell my parents because they had only improved like 50 points since I had first taken them back in around 8th grade. When they were mystified that my scores hadn't come back, they asked me to call one of my friends about it, and I just faked the phone call. But they eventually found out the scores had been released many months ago. Let's just say that this resulted in one of the most brutal beatings I had endured in my entire life. I think I was bruised and probably even bloody from that. This was even magnitudes worse than the bullying I had endured in school. And this was even in spite of the resistance I had to put up as a teenager at the time, which I didn't do when I was younger. But now, looking back, I think the resistance may have been what had gotten my dad to stop the beatings, which almost entirely disappeared by around the last 2 years of high school. Growing up, I remember, especially earlier in my life, that I was occasionally beaten for no particular reason. Maybe I was too young to understand and protested, and my parents would say something like, "This is for all the bad things you've done in general, or will do in the future, and we can do this whenever we feel like it." They also said something like, "I need to eat bitterness," or in Chinese, 吃苦, which means to endure hardships, something they claim I lacked when I brought home grades that were less than perfect, often due to the teacher's whims or just a minor slip-up here and there when taking the test. I'd like to turn this around and ask them to be careful of what they wished for, because if I gained the ability to eat bitterness, then I'm just not going to listen to them at all, because their only recourse was to beat me, and I could endure that hardship, eating bitterness of the beating. So, why did I not report my parents to the authorities? Well, back then, I didn't know of the options, and I was told that if they go to jail, I'd be sent back to China. And keep in mind, I did not become an American citizen until age 16. Plus, even if I didn't get sent back, I wondered how I'd pay for college, since I had zero employable skills as a kid. And because I was forced to study all the time, I had zero street smarts to make it on my own. One of my neighbors had a teenage daughter a few years older who had ran away many times, and I often would fantasize about that, about running away. But then I wondered how I would make it on my own, with zero ways of making money, not to mention giving up the dream of going to college. Maybe there were organizations for battered kids, especially Asian American kids, or scholarships for kids who endured abusive childhoods, but I doubt I'd qualify thanks to DEI and affirmative action, but that's a subject for another video here. I also remember about a decade ago, so much further past my childhood, when Amy Chua talked about tiger parenting and how it's superior to the Western style of parenting. Many other Asian Americans like myself were infuriated since it brought back memories of their horrible childhoods, like mine. It was almost like the Me Too movement in a way, but for Asian Americans of both genders. I also won't discount that there are plenty of Americans and other Westerners also growing up in broken families, or even overly strict parents like mine. But there have been also many other supportive parents with high expectations who managed to raise kids that attended Ivy League schools without ever having to physically beat them to get them there. I only started to open up about this after I had left home for college. The first time, I made a long post about my life story as I previously described here on a website called Gold Sea, an Asian American online community from decades ago, but I discovered that had been removed a few days later, the post itself. This website is still available right now if you Google Gold Sea. I also tried to subtly ask other Asian friends I had in college about this. But oftentimes the discussion would veer towards something like, you should be grateful for your parents. Or also, one of my older cousins even claimed that he's so grateful of his parents beating him for getting him on a successful path. But 3 decades later, and while I have a decent career, I still I still fail to feel grateful at all for what my parents have done, other than maybe keeping me away from drugs or something. It was only after people opened up, after Amy Chua talked about tiger parenting, and my discovery of the Asian parent stories community on Reddit, when I realized my story was not as unique as I had thought. From about age 13 or so, I was secretly planning for the day when I could pay my own bills and not have to financially depend on my parents, that I'll finally be able to leave this hell. I knew that I had to do fairly well in school, though not get perfect grades like they had demanded. They even claimed that grades mattered even more than my life itself. I knew I had to go to college to be employable. Well, when college came about, I was pressured into attending grad school and having to put up with more of their demands since they were paying for me. They made me feel like a failure if I decided to get a job after graduation. But since the beatings have long stopped, then, after all, I was away from home, I lost that sense of urgency and gave in, though they continued to make unreasonable demands on me, which I will not get into the details of here. And even after I had gotten a job, they continued to harass me over my life decisions if they didn't agree with them, like my career choice, where I lived, who I dated, etc. Later, I learned this was all related to something called filial piety, which is part of a lot of traditional Asian cultures, and something Confucius had developed. What they didn't realize, and what I didn't realize either at the time, was that Confucius also empowered the children who were mature enough to also contradict the parents' demands if they were unreasonable. In other words, filial piety didn't give parents the license to rule over their kids' lives well into adulthood like a king could over his subjects. Unfortunately, they have also managed to brainwash me into thinking the path I had taken in life in going to grad school immediately after college and trying again at another grad school after failing out the first one instead of immediately getting a job was the only possible path in life, and something I had a lot of trouble defending when I finished my second master's in 2009 in the depth of the financial crisis when interviewing at a countless number of companies at the time. So people have warned me about speaking out on this due to all of the anti-Asian violence and hatred and racism that's supposedly prevalent these days. Is it really, might I ask? However, I still insist on it, since plenty of other ethnic groups have also spoken out on the barbaric and inhumane practices of their culture that they have to endure even today, and even living in a Western country. For example, I listened on a podcast about a Pakistani woman living in the UK, about how she had a forced marriage, and when she refused, her brothers all beat her until she was bloody. Hey, I live in America now, and have been for decades, and I will exercise my right to free speech right here. So, if you've had a similar experience being subjected to the horrors of tiger parenting, I really would like to hear your story in the comments, as I have a feeling that I'm not the only one, and you've got a safe space here to let it all out. And please, subscribe to my channel, even though this is only the first video, but I'll be talking about other controversial topics here, away from my main one anyways. Peace.